All right, so I have to apologize. Some of you heard our discussion with Dave in the background, did you? Yeah, that was not intentional. I thought I had this thing muted. So Dave Hooker is our next speaker, and he will be on via Zoom here in just a minute. Let me get that brought up here.
While Dennis is doing that, I'll give you a little introduction to Dave Hooker. Dave Hooker has been with the University of Guelph in Ontario for 13 years, where he is research agronomist and assistant professor. He holds a BS, MS, and PhD in Ags and Crop Science from Guelph. Hooker's research interests include looking at entire cropping and mapping systems, incorporating genetics, soil fertility, and pest management. He is also a working group member around the development of yin. We've had we've had Dave here, I think, twice before in person. Obviously, with the issues of crossing from Canada to the United States, we will be able to have him present with us virtually, and we will also be able to ask questions at the end of his presentation, but we will have to use the mics because other than that, he won't be able to hear them.
All right. I can hear you very clearly in my headphones. It's kind of contradicting here with me. So what's missing in your wheat crop? And it's such a great topic, I think, is I love just to push the bar forward in terms of wheat management, making it the wheat enterprise as profitable as possible. Because once we do that, then we get more wheat incorporated into a cropping system, and we know the benefits that wheat has in our cropping system. And the way the commodity prices are today, it certainly favors wheat. It favors corn and soybeans as well, but the price of wheat is certainly competitive with corn and soybeans. And most people in the US, and I know in Canada too, and Ontario, we're struggling with high commodity prices for input prices. And so I think that, commodity prices have definitely rose with input prices, so thankfully they've done that. But I don't think we cannot afford, especially this year, we cannot afford to make a mistake. Something that's costing us yield could cost us significantly and reducing our revenues as well. And so I just think that we need to sharpen our pencils from both ends, and just to make sure that we are right on top of our game in terms of agronomic management to try to get the most possible out of our wheat crop. And that's really what's going to be my focus today. All right, so I'm just going to advance my slide here. And so a lot of you know where Ontario is, obviously, but Ridgetown here is way off to the right of the screen, at least to my right of the screen anyway. And Ridgetown is very much in line with Kalamazoo and Cedar Falls, Iowa, and Sioux City, Iowa. And I gave a talk in Iowa just a couple years ago, and they were just kind of amazed, that the latitude, Ridgetown, where my major research area is based out of, is approximately the same latitude as some of these other places in the U.S., just west of here. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And one thing that's interesting about that is that a lot of our crop production practices really would correlate very well, associate very well with those in Michigan especially. Ontario has a very similar environment that Michigan does, and I think a lot of the things that we do here and find that works well here also works well in Michigan. And we realize that through this YEN project, the Yield Enhancement Network, and my understanding is that you've talked a lot about the Yield Enhancement Network a lot this morning already, a lot today already, and it was just a great networking thing that we have going on with Dennis and Jody regarding the Yield Enhancement Network. And last year was our first year and highly significant. It was just a highly successful, I guess, just project that we started on. All right, so I think just to start, I'm just gonna start off with some technical aspects, and so then we'll get into the meat and potatoes, the fun part. and that is the agronomic management. But I think in order to really manage well, we need to know how yield is formed in the crop, because with each step of the way that how yield is formed in the crop, we really need to optimize our management in order to make these steps in the yield, these pieces that we put together, we call them yield components. We need to maximize each component, make those numbers as big as possible, because when we multiply all of those numbers out, that's what we get in terms of yield, right? And so we need to make sure that we make those numbers as big as possible, because when we make those numbers as big as possible, we multiply all those together. If those numbers are big, that means that the yield is big as well. And we need to optimize each part as they are formed in terms of our management and crop growth. And so yield, the main components for wheat yield is number of heads per square foot or per square yard. So that's a very important component, obviously. Number of seeds per head is another one. So if we have the number of heads per square foot, and if we have the number of seeds per head, that would equate, that equation, multiply those two numbers together, would equate to the number of seeds per square foot or per square yard or per acre, all right? Then if we have the seed weight with that, then we get our yield component in there as well. So bushels per acre or tons per acre would correlate to that, would be computed from those three numbers. So the question is, when are these components formed? What can we do to make these numbers as big as possible when they occur during the crop production cycle in order to make these numbers as big as possible? So we want to manage our crop to make those numbers as big as possible. So I really like this graph. It's a very complicated graph here. And this is in the Zadok scale. And so I know that you're used to the Feek scale, and I have some Feek equivalents upcoming in just a few slides, but at least you can tell that this is a planting timing, emergence and tillering, stem elongation, booting and heading and flowering, and so on and so forth. And so you can see the vegetative phase, the reproductive phase, and the grain fill phase here. Each of these phases is correlated to a different stages or a group of stages in cereal development. And then at the bottom here, we have the yield components, when the yield components are formed. So obviously, number of plants per square meter is determined very early on in the management process, very early on in the growing season. And so how can we vary that? How can we make that as big as possible? Well, we can adjust our seeding rates. Obviously, we can get seeding rates that are too low. We can make that number a little bit smaller than optimal. Or we can maybe double our normal seeding rate, and maybe that would be a too high of number, which would result in other issues during crop development. So it's not only making these numbers, these yield components, as big as possible, but we need to optimize them, right? Optimize them in order to make that yield at the end of the day as big as possible. So it's just very interesting here, just very briefly, that yield is mainly sink limited, and it's mainly sink limited here. So a sink could be, where you put your money in the bank. So if there was a limit on your bank account, so let's say your 401k, if there was a limit on that, well, that would be sink limited. If you had lots of money and you wanted to put more in your 401k, but you weren't allowed to, if it was at its maximum already, the amount of money that you can put in the 401k then would be sink limited. Like, it's only so big, it can't hold anymore. But in the wheat crop here, sink limited, you could have a certain number of grains, and those grains could be just packed as full as they can be. They can be as heavy as they can be, and it doesn't matter how much more photosynthesis goes on, those kernels are at maximum weight. And so we say that the yield is limited because those kernels are at a maximum weight, and we say that that yield is sink limited. Now, wheat tends to be sink limited. Once we get to quite high yields or normally high yields, our wheat tends to be sink limited more than source limited. If something was source limited, that means that something is, really reducing the photosynthetic rate. More energy, more starch, more protein can be packed into those kernels, but there's not enough nutrients available, or there's not enough photosynthesis going on to pack those kernels. So if that was the case, that would be a source limitation. So most of you, I know, have heard of the source versus sink before, but it's very important to know those relationships when you're figuring out, like, what is really limiting my wheat yield? Because as soon as you know what's limiting your wheat yield, then there's an opportunity to manage your wheat yields as well. If you didn't know what was limiting your wheat yields, there's no way that you just have to guess, say, well, maybe this is limiting or that is limiting. But if you can focus on an area where your wheat yield was limiting, then you can maybe manage that area for higher wheat yields, or have a better chance of success at managing a very specific area if your wheat yields were limited due to a specific factor or two. So this is very interesting. In wheat is usually sink limited, which really means that there's not enough kernels that have been established in the wheat crop in order for them to be filled. A lot of those kernels, they are at close to maximum weight. And even though that there's photosynthesis, there's nutrient uptake and whatnot, those things can't be, there's nowhere for them to go if a crop was sink limited. So the interesting thing is with wheat is that this area right here between stem elongation and flowering, this is the area, this is a time frame where that sink size, the potential sink size, the number of seeds, right, per square foot, when that is established. And this might get a little bit confusing here. It's just interesting. It's interesting to me anyway, that this part, when the crop is establishing this potential, it tends to be source limited, all right? So the crop is looking at this potential to establish the number of seeds per square foot is determined by the source, so how fast the crop is growing. So it's very interesting, right? When we talk about source and sink. In wheat, usually the high yields are limited because of low sink. So we need more seeds per square foot, and the potential number of seeds per square foot is determined in this time frame here between stem elongation and flowering. And that's when the number of seeds per square foot is established. And that process is source limited. So for me, when I manage my crop, I want to make sure that this crop is growing as fast as it can. If it's establishing the sink, the biggest sink possible. And so I see this as a tremendous area right here where we really need to focus on our management. Now, unfortunately, if you're a corn and soybean grower like I am, I'm focusing a lot on my corn and soybean, like weed control and applying nitrogen on my corn, for instance, and maybe fungicide as well. But really, I should also be focusing on my wheat crop and paying attention to my wheat crop, because it's in this phase right here where that potential sink size is being determined. And again, that potential sink size is really what is limiting our wheat yields from going even higher than what it is today. All right? So this is just an image right here, and it just shows you this critical period right here. So this is the yield sensitivity to this source strength. So how fast that crop is growing. And as you notice, it's like most people think it's right around in anthesis or flowering, or just shortly after flowering. That is a critical stage. And that exactly is like partially true, but the bigger picture is that this critical phase right here happens about 30 days before anthesis to about 10 days after anthesis. So that is the critical phase. That's when we really need to pay attention. Like, is the wheat crop growing as fast as it can? So this is the maximum sensitivity of source strength right here, where if we have some issue with the crop right around this phase, like right before anthesis or right during anthesis, if we have some issue, so it could be disease, or it could be a nitrogen deficiency, or some other deficiency, sulfur or manganese deficiency, anything that reduces the crop growth rate, the wheat crop is very sensitive during this period. And what it does is just, it cuts back on the number of seeds that it sets per square foot. And then if the weather turns around, if, let's say, you apply late nitrogen on your wheat, the crop growth rate could go back up, like after anthesis and during the grain fill period here. But the number of seeds per square foot has already been set. We can't change that not very much. So even though that we create tremendous looking crop, sometimes that crop is limited because of the number of seeds that can be filled. Those seeds, only so much can be packed into those seeds before the seeds can't accept anymore, and that's why yield is generally sink limited, all right? So if there's any questions at all, maybe whisper them to Dennis, and he'll put them in the chat, and I think we're gonna have a period at the end where there'll be a good Q&A at the end of my talk here. All right, so just a couple more like really boring kind of technical graphs that we have here. This is just a relationship between grain number here. So obviously grain number is very important yield component, grain number per square foot or per square yard. And then that is highly correlated here to spike biomass. So the weight of the heads per square meter in this case is very much correlated to the grain number. So me as a manager, I want to make sure that those wheat heads are as big as possible, are as heavy as possible, because if I have that, that means that it's very correlated to the grain number here, and that is correlated, of course, to the yield. It's a major yield component. So how do I get heavy heads or heavy spikes? So the higher the head biomass here, the higher the grain number. And if we look at the spike biomass here and the crop growth rate, this is the crop growth rate at the bottom of this graph here. And this is how fast that the crop is growing. So grams per square meter per day. So that's how fast, how much biomass the crop is accumulating per day. And we call that the crop growth rate. And you notice here, the higher the crop growth rate, the faster that crop is growing. Like right at anthesis or right before anthesis, the higher the spike biomass. So this is why it's so important to pay attention to your crop, to figure out what is limiting your crop growth rate. Sometimes we have no control over it. Sometimes Mother Nature, right, throws a curveball at us, and maybe it's dry out or too dry. There's nothing we can do about that unless we have irrigation, obviously. But of course, soil health would play in that as well, help the roots grow deeper and get more water. And so there's ways to manage around that a little bit. But there's other ways to manage crop growth rate. Crop growth rate, of course, is often limited. Maybe nitrogen is limiting. Maybe manganese is limiting, or some other nutrient availability, maybe that is limiting. Or maybe a disease, for instance, is limiting the crop growth rate, reducing the leaf area in terms of intercepting that sunlight. And so we want fast canopy closure, right? And that will intercept most of the sunlight, and photosynthesis will be at its maximum. That's really what we're after. Maximum photosynthesis really maximizes the crop growth rate as well. So my star here, my major goal here, and this, I guess, really is the end of my technical portion of the presentation. The management goal here is to increase the head biomass, or to increase or to make sure that the crop growth rate is as high as it can be. All right, so what's missing in your wheat production here? So I call these prerequisites for high yields, and I kind of stole this from Dr. Fred Below from University of Illinois, and so he gives his talks on high yields, the secrets to high yield corn and soybeans. And so I haven't heard him give one on wheat. Maybe we should have one for wheat as well. But there are some prerequisites for these high yields. High yielding genetics, so I'm not going to talk very much about varieties today. High yielding genetics, very important. Adequate drainage, wheat doesn't like wet feet. Soil structure, obviously, low soil compaction, soil health, they're all prerequisites for high yields. Uniform residue spread from the combine, those are all important, I guess, variables that we need to control in order to facilitate quick even emergence of our wheat crop. So residue spread from our combine, after soybean harvest or something like that. It just drives me crazy to look at the fields, to see like combines with poor chopper settings, or maybe the spreader isn't spreading like it should, and it's sometimes associated. A lot of the times it's associated with the wider heads, soybean heads that are on combines today. It's just difficult to get a uniform spread pattern, 40 feet across, and so that is becoming more of a challenge. But that is a prerequisite for high yields. Fungicide seed treatment is basic staple, I think, for wheat management. Controlling weeds, of course. Plant when the soil is fit. If we mud our wheat in, there's a little chance of success, that we're going to have the ultra high yields that we're looking for if we mud our wheat in. And also sulfur management, manganese if it's needed, and also harvesting early. That's important too, especially on the quality side, because we know that if harvesting is delayed because of weather, it could have some test weight issues, and that could reduce the quality on the test weight side. So we're not going to talk about test weight today. So I'm not sure if test weight is a very, I guess controversial term. It is in Ontario. We just mentioned test weight to growers, and a huge debate erupts on the effects of test weight. Like, is it really associated with yield or quality, and how to manage test weight? But we're not going to talk about test weight today. So I just want to mention 7 different management strategies you can, do or implement on the farm for high wheat yields. And I have a little box in the upper corner here, and it's just a reminder of the components, some of the major components that are affected. So in this case, I tuned up seed drill. And so Dennis has been doing a lot of work, Dennis and Manny have been doing a lot of work on precision planting, different seeders, and for precision planting. We know the impact precision planting has on corn. Maybe not so much on soybeans. We know that soybeans, it's important in soybeans, but not as important it is in corn. And the question is, should we pay the same attention as we do for wheat as we do for corn in terms of precision planting? So our goal for precision planting, have the plants spaced uniformly apart. So no significant gaps or clumps or doubles or triples or quadruples in wheat. So you often see some clumping in the wheat just because the plants are so close together. But even emergence. So we know that for corn, this is the most important part or component of precision planting, is even emergence. And so with my drill, I have, I just modified my drill with some parts from Needham. I'll just give a plug for Needham here in Kentucky. And so this is, I outfitted my drill a couple of years ago. I put a closing wheel on and an ultra narrow press wheel here, and modified the boot so it doesn't move around as much. So my goal is for placing the seeds at a consistent uniform depth, and I did this rather cheaply compared to a new precision drill with downforce and whatnot. So I went with a cheaper approach on my drill, and this is what it looked like. And I also put new blades on the drill here while I was at it. But a tuned up drill is important, and it could have been a prerequisite, but because I think it's very important to have a tuned up drill in order to achieve high wheat goals. My second point here is seeding early. And I'm showing a map of Ontario here, obviously, but you can see just all the different seeding rate trials or seeding timing trials that we've done. In the northern part of Ontario, we have to plant early. If we don't have the growing season in the fall to establish at least 2 to 3 tillers per plant, we have to plant early in order to get enough growth on those plants in order for those 2 to 3 tillers per plant to form. And so therefore we have to plant ultra early up here into August in the northern part of Ontario. And then in the southern part around Bridgetown and Essex County, we're into the October. So early to late October in the southern part of the province. And so of course you can draw lines over here to Michigan. And I think these planting dates, I think they would correlate very well to Michigan work as well, Michigan data. But seeding early is one of the keys for high yields. If you seed late, obviously, is going to reduce your yield potential. And whatever you do, like with a late seeded wheat crop, there's only so much you can do in terms of making sure that you have the highest yield possible. So the one way to manage wheat, of course, is to maximize this yield potential as early as possible and have nothing take it away. To give your wheat crop, not give your wheat crop a bad day. One bad day could reduce your yield potential. So seeding early. And this is our rule, 1.1 bushel per acre per day delay beyond the optimal dates here. So if we're like a week late in planting beyond the optimal date, we've already cut our yield back by 7.7 bushel per acre, which is significant. Look at the price of wheat today, multiply 7.7 bushel, and that's significant revenue that has been lost immediately for a late planting date. And sometimes it's difficult to get wheat planted on time. And one of the reasons why is because of soybeans. Sometimes soybeans are planted late and then harvested late, but also weather. Of course, Mother Nature plays a role in soybean harvest as well. So this is what we have in Ontario, in Ontario's agronomy guide. If winter wheat is planted, we should select a variety that is between 0.5 and 1 maturity group less than a full season soybean variety for a particular area. So growers have kind of a problem with this, and they say, well, if I plant a shorter season soybean variety, that means we're losing yield potential. And that is absolutely true. And so for our data that we have from our performance trials, for every day delay in soybean maturity, so if our soybeans are extended well into the growing season, for every day delay that we have in our soybean maturity, the soybean maturity date, our yield goes up by 0.7 bushel per acre, and that is our soybean. So we have to balance this 1.1 bushel per acre loss, right, in our wheat crop with the loss that we're seeing in our soybean enterprise by growing an early soybean variety. So again, that's 0.7 bushel per acre for every day delay in soybean maturity. So if we shorten our soybean variety up, so 0.5 to 1 maturity group, so if that is, let's say, 7 or 8 days earlier, so we're losing like a good between 4 and 5 bushel yield potential in our soybeans. So this is something that growers will have to wrestle with in terms of penciling out the economics. Should you grow a late season or full season soybean variety, or would you like to get wheat planted on time? So again, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the wheat enterprise brings so much value to the cropping system. And so we have to look at the wheat enterprise not only for the revenue that the wheat enterprise brings, right, to the farm enterprise, but also the other services that the wheat provides to the cropping system, right? And so this is where you have to judge, like losing a bit on the soybean enterprise, gain maybe on the wheat enterprise, but yet if you have winter wheat planted, that means that all these other services come into play in terms of higher corn yields after wheat, higher soybean yields after wheat. The ability to grow cover crops or implement cover crops is much easier after wheat than it is in just a corn-soybean rotation. And so those are just a few examples there. So should we use soybean maturity group as our sole decision on choosing soybean varieties? And the answer to that is no. And I'll explain that in a little bit here. So here we have performance trials in Ontario as well for soybeans, corn, and wheat. And so this is from one of our soybean performance trials. And here we have the company maturity group ratings. So this is a fairly early, like it's a more northern performance trial that we have here. Performance maturity groups from 0.0 to 1.4 here, and then the days to maturity. And you notice the slope. So the longer the maturity here, the longer the maturity group. And that makes sense, right? It's pretty much common sense. And this is the slope of the line. This is the slope 0.08, which means that for every day, we're looking at a later maturity group by 0.08. So this is falls right in the guideline in a lot of the research in US and Canada as well. So this is a rule of thumb. For every one maturity group in our soybean, we can alter our maturity date by about 10 days. So this is a rule of thumb, about 0.1 milligram per day, or 0.1 maturity group per day, sorry. And this is 0.08, is very close to this guideline right here. So I just wanted to, I guess, reinforce this guideline right here with actual data. So when you want to advance your potential seeding date for wheat, maybe by 10 days, maybe you should be bringing back your soybean maturity by one maturity group, for instance. So that is the rule of thumb. But that is just looking at maturity group. So you notice the scatter in the dots right here. So each one of these represents different varieties right here. So I just want to show you, just to compare these three varieties right here. These three varieties, they're all in the same maturity group. They're 1.0 maturity group, but yet they have 4 days difference in days to maturity. So all of our soybean performance trial locations, they're all rated in terms of days to maturity. And so they rank their soybean varieties what day they matured on. And in this case, 1.0 maturity group, same variety, same maturity rating, but 4 days difference in terms of the maturity rating. And of course, that is related very closely to harvest maturity too. So if you had the choice, for instance, in this case, of choosing these three varieties, say, well, these three varieties are excellent varieties, I'm not sure which ones to pick for my soybean crop, I want to plant winter wheat afterwards, I would definitely pick this one, or this would be of interest to me because it matures 4 days earlier, say, than this one. So if I can plant my wheat crop 4 days earlier, that could mean 4.4 bushel per acre more wheat yield potential if I plant 4 days earlier, at least if I'm around that optimal planting date period. So it's just very intriguing, right? How we can select and manage our soybean enterprise in order to influence our wheat enterprise later on. So I just have another example. All of these varieties here, they're within 0.2 maturity group, but yet we have 6 days in maturity ratings. And so when they actually matured. And so it just astounds me that how variable these maturity group ratings are just based on company ratings. And so I just think, including myself, I think we just need to dig a little bit deeper and maybe fine tune our variety selection using maybe another layer of data, and that's when the maturity, when maturity happens, the day of maturity for soybeans. So select a variety that is 0.5 to 1 maturity group less than the target. This is our recommendation in our book. But the real recommendation is, I think we can fine tune that. I think we should compare days to maturity as well. And I think for wheat growers, I think that we should bring that into our soybean variety selection, bring in days to maturity. And I'm not sure if that is available or not in Michigan, whether the performance trials in Michigan rate for days to maturity or not. So it's just interesting there. Okay. So number 3, adjust seeding rate to planting date and soil type. So this is interesting as well. And really we need more data to do justice. I think we do have some data, and a lot of this data that we have are not set up like in extreme intensive replicated trials across the province or across Michigan, but I think some trials have been started to look at seeding rate by planting date. But we have noticed in a lot of fields, in Ontario especially, that if we plant, like so this is the curve right here. So this is a curve, so this is a seeding rate, number of seeds per acre, and this is millions of seeds. So I just forgot to put millions here. So this is 0.9 million seeds per acre. So that's a fairly low seeding rate. And notice this yield here, this is the optimal seeding date. This is the yield at optimal seeding date at various seeding rates here. And the yield was really within only 4 bushel per acre between 0.9 and 2.1 million seeds per acre, which is tremendous. Like, wheat seeds are expensive. That's one expense that if we can optimize, we can improve our revenues, our returns, right, in our wheat enterprise if we can reduce the seeding rates. If you use bin run seed, obviously, it's not going to be that important, but of course, if you have if you have to buy the seed and pay tremendous amounts to your seed company, of course we have optimal seeding rates here, and depending on when you seed it. So this is optimal seeding rate, and this is at the same location but a late seeding date. So this is about 2 weeks beyond the optimal seeding rate. And notice the seeding rate difference here. So the 0.9, about 106 bushel per acre. And then as we increase the seeding rate, it seemed to increase the yields almost exponentially. So sometimes we get into locations where we get into November or even the first part of December, like we're a month or 5 weeks after the seeding date. And really there's no high end or top end in terms of how many seeds you can apply to make that yield top out in terms of with a late seeded crop. And of course economics plays a big role in that as well. So you can only afford to put on so much seed. But the rule of thumb here, the story here is that if you're late seeding, you should increase the seeding rates. And the rule of thumb that we have in Ontario is that we increase our seeding rate by 200,000 seeds per week past the optimum seeding date. So if we're 2 weeks behind, we should be looking at increasing or bumping up our seeding rate by 400,000 seeds per acre. And that's our general recommendation that we have. There's going to be differences, obviously. This isn't going to hold true for every field. If you're on a clay soil type, fairly hard soil, tough wheat growing soil, perhaps, like you may want to boost your seeding rates according to that as well, in addition to seeding rate. But for the seeding rate and planting date, this is our general rule of thumb here. All right, so that's number 3. And number 4, we have starter phosphorus in the furrow. And we've done so much work here in Ontario looking at seed-placed phosphorus. And so we need 5 times, we need to broadcast 5 times more MAP on our wheat crop compared to in-furrow placed or seed-placed MAP applications in order to get the same response. 5 times as much fertilizer if we broadcast it versus seed-placed. And with fertilizer, as expensive as it is today, obviously we want to maximize the efficiency of our fertilizer and get the most out of little fertilizer we can. And phosphorus is one of these things one of the nutrients that wheat responds the most to, and that is phosphorus. Of course, nitrogen is the other one, but phosphorus is the most important nutrient at planting time that you can manipulate. And in some of our long-term trials that we have huge effects, and we get pictures, photos sent in all the time where growers are placing fertilizer in furrow with the seed, and something has gone wrong with their planter. The chain jumped off, on the fertilizer drive, or it ran out of fertilizer through the end of the field, and that makes a really good check strip, right? And but we see this in our plots as well. And so just the delay in development is just huge here. So here's a picture in the fall compared no phosphorus in furrow versus phosphorus or MAP applied with the seed. Just tremendous side-by-side differences. These were planted the same day. Everything else was the same, except no phosphorus, no MAP was applied with the seed in this strip right here. Just tremendous. And this delay continues throughout the growing season as well. And you just notice the thinness of the canopy where the no phosphorus is applied here compared to the plot right beside it where we have seed placed phosphorus. Just tremendous. And we do have yield data from this as well. So this is my drill, and it's just kind of fuzzy, just how I took this picture here, but you can see some granules of MAP and with my wheat seed. So I have it treated here. My wheat seed is treated, and I put the I mix the wheat seed and the fertilizer. My agribusiness does that, and it's kind of a pain to do, and it's kind of an extra step, but then I just auger it into my drill, and it becomes a really good practice and eliminates a lot of that variable heading time. The crop canopy closes much earlier, and we have much higher yields as well. And so here's some of the yield data that we have on some of our long-term trials. So we have a long-term P&K study that we just finished, and we have up to 30 site years. And so we don't have quite as many site years with the wheat, but we have 30 site years in our long-term P&K trials with corn, soybeans, and wheat. And then we can compare fertility side by side. So where we have fairly low phosphorus and potassium, so low, I mean less than 20 parts per million of phosphorus, and less than 120 parts per million of potash, where we applied no fertilizer in this with the seed, so no MAP with the seed, 69 bushel per acre. But where we apply MAP with the seed, where we have a low soil test of low P&K, our yield is 15 bushel per acre greater. And this is very consistent. Sometimes this is greater than 15. Other times it might be just 10. But with the price of the wheat the way it is today, and a 10 bushel yield response, even though that fertilizer is expensive, it just easily pays for that fertilizer cost, that MAP that's put with the seed. And remember, we need to apply 5 times more MAP broadcast than if we work it in, 5 times more fertilizer just to get the same response. And we have other trials that show this. So soil test, if your soil test levels are low, we can expect these responses. If soil test levels are moderate, so over 20 parts per million of phosphorus and over 120 parts per million of soil test K, we don't expect to see as much starter response, right, compared to a low soil test. But probably there are areas in the field, phosphorus is extremely spatially variable in the field, and so there's probably areas in the field with relatively low phosphorus soil tests where we do expect a response, right? And if you want to maintain your soil test values, the best time to apply phosphorus, the greatest chance of a payback with that phosphorus is in the wheat crop, okay? So we can discuss that a little bit later on, but soil test is very important. So I just want to show the data in a little bit different form here, and this is kind of interesting here. So here we have that 69 and 84 bushel response here with no starter versus starter, 15 bushel response. But where we have moderate soil P&K, notice where the yields are. 69, 84, this is a high rate P&K starter, very high rate, so we're getting close to the maximum amount of fertilizer that we want to apply with the seed, and we got 84 bushel per acre here. But where we have moderate soil test levels, moderate to high soil test levels, notice where the yields are. They're way above what we achieved, like even the 84 bushel per acre. We have yields in the mid-90s here, low to mid-90s. A 10 bushel per acre yield response here with moderate testing, soil P&K values. So this is another key, I think, for high wheat yields, and we've seen this time and time again, and very highly replicated number of locations across Ontario where we've built up our P&K soil tests. We see higher wheat yields, higher than what we could have ever achieved with any fertilizer, starter fertilizer that we could have applied in a low soil test situation. So this is important, I think. I don't think this year I don't think this year is the year to build soil test levels up. But in the future, obviously, when fertilizer prices come back down, I think we should definitely consider building our soil test values in order to capture this extra yield in wheat. And interesting enough, we also see similar yield responses in soybean. We see 4 bushel per acre higher soybean yields where we've built up our soil P&K, and also higher corn yields as well. So over 10 bushel per acre higher corn yields where we built up our soil test P&K values, and they're 10 bushel per acre higher yields, more than what we could have ever received, regardless of how much starter fertilizer that we applied. So of course it depends on your situation. If you have a rented farm, if you're renting a farm and on a lease, a short-term lease, of course it's more difficult. You might not want to build up your soil test values there, but of course if you own the farm or have a long-term lease, building your soil test levels up, I think is a good point number 5 here. And number 6, I almost have to take a breath because I have 7, so we're just about done here. Number 6 shows a nitrogen by fungicide synergy, and this is really what we've been talking about in the past couple of years. I know I've given talks in Michigan previously a couple of years ago on this synergy. But if we apply nitrogen at 90 pounds per acre and no fungicide, like this was our standard strategy here, 90 bushel per acre, and if we applied a fungicide, we get an 8 bushel per acre yield response. So a T3 fungicide, so a fungicide at flowering time to control or suppress fusarium. We also get some leaf disease control there, but an 8 bushel yield response. And interesting, in a no fungicide, if we increase our nitrogen using modern varieties, our yield response has also increased. And it just so happens that with this very robust data set, hundreds of data points are averaged within each one of these numbers. Our yields do go up by 8 bushel per acre again. But this is the synergy here. Synergy means that it's more than additive. So we have 8 bushel here, 8 bushel here, and then if we combine both fungicide and high nitrogen, we get a 19 bushel per acre response, and this is where the synergy comes from. So in this case, in this example, 8 plus 8 does not equal 16, 8 plus 8 equals 19, and so that's where we get the synergy from. And so this is the key here, I think, when we look at reducing that stress, like right before enthesis or right during enthesis, that time period where it's sensitive, the wheat plant is sensitive to that source limitation because we want to build up a big sink. The nitrogen by fungicide here interaction, I think it's most important here. And so that's why in this box I have seeds per head in like the biggest font that I had, because this is the number that is increased the most of this strategy. And then thirdly, the second responsive variable here is the seed weight, and that's mainly due to the fungicide application. And then, of course, the number of heads per square foot, that's not going to change. That is already determined, right, from tillering and winter survival and whatnot. So this practice really doesn't influence that that much, and we can discuss that if there's time at the end as well. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through this. I thought maybe we'd have a little bit more time, but I'm rambling on is a little bit more than I thought I would. But we've also done a lot of work in fungicide timing effects. And I don't think I showed this slide in my talks previously in Michigan. Maybe my counterpart, Peter Johnson, did at one point. But we have a T1 application, so this is at right around herbicide application timing between weeks 5 and 6. And then T2 is around flag leaf timing, and T3 is around that flowering timing. But we get a lot of questions from growers. What are the yield responses if we maybe make an application at T1 and another one at T3? And so this would be this T1, T3 kind of bar right here. So these lines right here represent our average response to these applications. So at T1, just maybe a couple bushel per acre response at the T1. So we don't see much yield response with the fungicide application here. But at T2, So right around flag leaf timing, controls leaf disease, could maximize crop growth rate, especially if diseases are moving up in the canopy, if diseases are stressing the crop out and reducing that crop growth rate that we mentioned earlier on. We tend to see bigger responses with those later fungicide applications. So T2, T3, basically the same yield response here. But if we apply at T3, and if it's a product that controls or suppresses fusarium, fusarium is a big issue in Ontario as it is in Michigan as well. And we can control leaf disease, get a yield response, and also suppress fusarium at the same time. So I really like the T3 application more than T2. But if we have a disease situation, if we have leaf rust, if we have septoria moving up in the canopy, we want to make sure that we keep those leaves green, especially the flag leaf and the penultimate leaf green, and in order to sustain high crop growth rates from just before anthesis to after anthesis as well. So sometimes we need to do a combination of fungicide treatments here. And these bars right here, they represent the range of fungicide responses that we have in our data. And I just had to include these in our trials here. So just for instance, this T3 fungicide application, some of our trials, some of our data, we have up to 20 bushel per acre yield response with a T3 application of fungicides. And so with all of these highly responsive yields right here, 20 bushel, 30 bushel, even 18 bushel per acre yield response, those are probably in varieties that have some susceptibility to leaf disease, or in some environments that favor disease, and we control that disease. And this is where we get those big yield responses if we can control the disease. Now conversely, if we don't have very much disease in the canopy, if our variety is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of suppressing and controlling that disease, related to the disease triangle, we don't see much fungicide response in that situation either. So really we need to base our fungicide decisions on the disease triangle. And we can't get into the disease triangle today, but looking at the pathogen, is the pathogen present? Looking at the environment, is the environment favorable for infection? And also the genetics, is the genetic susceptible? And we need all of those three factors to be favorable, or at least partially favorable, in order to get disease. And so I get a lot of questions all the time, like, should I spray a fungicide on my wheat crop? There's very little disease in my crop, but when I'm looking at the weather forecast, we're getting a lot of heavy dews, the environment seems to be favorable, and looking at the variety characteristics, that variety is susceptible to septoria, should I apply a fungicide? And in that case, considering all of those variables, I think that could trigger a fungicide application decision. And I think that's great fungicide resistant strategy. So we need to look at a lot of those variables in order to make those decisions whether to apply a fungicide or not. And lastly, we have managing lodging risk. And I know I think I'm just about I'm a little bit over time, I think. Managing lodging risk, and embarrassingly enough, this is one of my fields on my home farm this past year, and I'm kind of making fun of myself because I am, come across as someone who knows everything about wheat. But yet on my own farm, there are huge issues on my own farm, and of course, just like all of us, like 2020, we have 2020 vision, hindsight, 2020 vision, hindsight, and there's some things that I would have done differently last year. But last year, of course, I wanted to maximize wheat yield because of the commodity prices, and so I put more nitrogen on than I thought that I needed and that I should have put on, and it was just a highly lodging risk year, and I didn't realize that it was until, of course, Mother Nature threw us a curveball and made it a very lodging susceptible, high risk year in terms of lodging. So this is my wheat field, and 2021, lots of lodging, and so I tweeted this as well, and there's a lot of factors associated with lodging that I won't get into just for the sake of time. But we know that variety plays a huge role, and here's one of the performance trials that we have for wheat at Ridgetown. And this is a drone shot of some of the wheat that's lodging at Ridgetown. And we want to put enough nitrogen on these trials in order to really test these varieties out for lodging susceptibility. And we got those conditions last year at Ridgetown, and so we can rate the varieties quite well. And these are the PGRs, so plant growth regulators are very important to regulate lodging potential. And so this is without a plant growth regulator, high rate nitrogen, and this is with a plant growth regulator applied just at stem elongation, at the beginning of stem elongation. And notice it helped. It didn't prevent lodging totally, but it definitely helped reduce lodging potential. And we have quite a few PGR projects in Ontario, and we have 3 at Winchester, which is in eastern Ontario, and Arva, just north of London, and at Ridgetown. But you know what, at Arva, we have untreated check, 102 bushel per acre. And then 2 of our most popular plant growth regulators, and they did increase yield by 6 bushel per acre by controlling lodging at Arva. And not so much at Ridgetown. We didn't get any effect with yield at Ridgetown, because at Ridgetown, we applied 220 pounds per acre of nitrogen in some plots at Ridgetown, and we did not see very much lodging at Ridgetown. It's just the area did not pose a significant risk for lodging because of a number of different factors. But at Arva, there was a huge risk. And this is at Arva again, and this is some lodging scores. So the higher the score here, the more it lodged. And so you can see as the nitrogen rate increased, so this is in pounds per acre, the higher the lodging. And so the more lodging occurred where we didn't apply a plant growth regulator. But where we controlled or limited the amount of nitrogen if it didn't lodge very much, of course, the plant growth regulator did not have an effect on lodging, and it didn't have an effect on yield either. So that yield boost was mainly associated with lodging potential, how much of that lodging was reduced. So this is my final slide, finally, right? So agronomic keys for high yields: consider yield components when they are formed. And if you know when the yield components are formed, then you can maximize or optimize around those yield components, maximize those numbers in order to make them as big as possible. And consider those source-sink relationships. Wheat yield is generally sink limited, and it's sink limited because it's source limited, right? Just right around anthesis or right before anthesis. And so we need to make sure that the crop growth rate is growing is as high as it can be in order to establish a number of sinks, a high number of sinks, and then they can be filled during the grain fill period. And then we talked about these prerequisites and adjusting planting dates so they're early, so that's important. We also talked about fertility and fungicide, and there are many other considerations, of course, and we need to bring in economics when we make the final decisions. But at least if you know the yield responses and you know the price of these inputs, then you can make those agronomic decisions based on the economics. All right? So are there any questions? I see some questions.
Dave, can
I'm
you
not
hear
sure
me?
how much time we have, but so just cut me off if you want.
Dave, can you hear us?
Yes, just barely, but I can hear you.
I can repeat it.
Okay.
So you probably can hear
Okay.
me. Yeah.
Well, we've got, I think there was a question or two on chat if you want to take a look at them.
Yeah. Did you see those in chat, Dave?
Yes, I do. Yep.
Go ahead and answer those first if you want, and then we'll pass the microphone
okay.
around here.
Okay. So the first question is, how do high temperatures during grain fill affect yield? And they do affect yield. So high temperatures is one of the weather parameters that really affect yield potential. And mainly it's the seed number that it affects. The number of good seeds, and it could affect again, the sink size. So high temperatures around anthesis or right before anthesis that affects the number of seeds per square foot. And especially it would interact quite strongly with moisture, the moisture status. So if you have a high temperature situation and the moisture status is good, so the wheat can take up enough water and can transpire, just that process helps to cool the canopy down, and so you don't get as many of the negative high temperature consequences in terms of wheat production. But if it's dry and if it's hot, that's like the double whammy of Mother Nature has on wheat performance, and it can reduce the length of the grain fill period, but most importantly, it can reduce the number of seeds per square meter, reduce that sink. All right, so that's the first question. Hopefully that answers that question. So the second question is with MAP. So mixing MAP with seed, do you get any settle out in the drill box with MAP? And no, surprisingly, we do not. And so some MAP is of different quality, and some MAP is rather dusty and of different particle sizes. And so that kind of MAP quality is probably not the MAP that I would like in my drill, especially if it's dusty. There's nothing worse than filling a grain drill up and you can't even see because of the dust in the MAP. Like I've had a few sources of MAP like that. If the granules are very similar in size, in that picture that I showed, it showed the dark MAP, there's a white MAP, but the dark MAP is usually the MAP that I prefer, and it's not as dusty, and it does not settle out as much as you'd think it would. So, and what is the cost per acre for mixing seed with fertilizer at the mill? In fact, they have not charged me anything. So just as long as I buy the seed from the agribusiness and buy the fertilizer from the agribusiness, they have not charged me an extra fee for doing that blend.
And then you got a third question there.
All right, so fly-free date. What planting date for better yield? So if you plant there early, ultra early, so you do have to be aware of the Hessian fly issue, especially in Michigan. In Ontario, even in Essex County, in all of my years in agronomic work, like several decades, we have never had a Hessian fly issue. But I realize probably in southern Michigan, there might be a chance of Hessian fly issue, especially if you have an ultra early planting. And if you do have an ultra early planting, I didn't mention in my presentation that it is very common to have your seeding rates or adjust it down to that 0.9 million seeds per acre if you have an ultra early planting, which is about maybe 2 weeks before the optimal seeding date.
All right, that was the only questions that we had on the chat box. Does anybody else have any questions for Dave?
All right.
Back here. Jody's bringing a microphone.
Okay.
I'll relay a question to you in a second here, Dave.
Are you gonna read it? Okay.
How come with all this money we're throwing at the wheat, we still have lodging and we don't have disease resistance?
This is a great question for you, Dave. How come with all this money we are throwing at wheat that we don't have lodging resistance and disease resistance?
Yeah, so no variety is perfect, right? So that's why we have so many different varieties. If there was a perfect variety, there would be only one variety to grow. And when I give a talk on corn hybrid selection, I say the same thing. There's no one corn hybrid that is ideal or perfect. And so obviously, like in high wheat yielding situation, when we want to maximize crop growth rate, the problem is, of course, that's associated with the biomass of the crop itself. How much can accumulate in the above ground canopy is very closely correlated to yield. So the heavier the crop, the heavier the yield, the more yield potential. And of course, that poses a huge problem for managers, for one thing. So how hard can we push wheat before it lodges? And also it becomes a problem for wheat breeders as well, because if more resources are devoted to roots, because there's root lodging, right? So not only do stems break and cause lodging, I've learned just recently in the past couple of years that root lodging plays a big role in the lodging that we see in Ontario and Michigan as well. So if the plant devotes more resources into thicker stems or into bigger roots, that takes away from the yield production as well. So some wheat varieties, we can get around that. The plant breeders have adjusted like plant height. It can lower the center of gravity and also stem strength. But really, we need to test these varieties out, and that's what we did. That's what we're doing with our wheat performance trials at Ridgetown or in Ontario, is we really push nitrogen on these trials, and in order to test the varieties out for lodging resistance. So I struggle with the same question on my farm as well. It's the balancing that, and it kind of makes farming fun. In one way, you want to optimize, but you don't want to optimize or push the inputs too much. And so there's a strategy there.
Yeah. Does anybody else
I think
have
it's fun.
We'll take one or two more questions. We got one right here.
When mixing the phosphate and the seed together, is there a time period that you think you need to get it planted where the seed viability will decrease over time, having it mixed with the phosphate?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we get that question a lot. And so a lot of growers here in Ontario, they've been doing this for 15, 20 years. I'm not sure how popular it is in the US. I just don't know how popular it is. But we get these questions a lot. And I farm with my dad, and I still do. He's 88 years old. And not until 5 years ago where I convinced him that we should be putting fertilizer in the drill. So up until then, this is what I do. Like, I look at research and look at like these agronomic practices that generate high yield, and he was the toughest to convince, that we should be putting fertilizer in the drill. So that's one of the questions that we get, is how long can you keep the wheat seed and fertilizer mixed before you affect the germination? And the answer to that is that we have quite a few growers. I know several growers who couldn't get that mix or blend planted in that fall and have essentially kept that mix dry in a hopper wagon in the shed, tarped, and planted it the next fall, and they couldn't see any effect at all on germination. And so that's a pretty good answer to me, I think, and that's just not one occurrence. So we have multiple growers doing this, and we get that question a lot, and the answer to that is, as long as you keep it dry and it tarped in a hopper wagon or whatnot in a shed, in a dry shed, obviously, there shouldn't be any worries.
One last question. Anybody have one last question right here?
Got one last question for you, Dave.
How do you figure out the gate setting on your drill to know how much seed and how much fertilizer you're getting on?
Yeah, that's a very good question as well. So the gate setting. So if I know the weight of seed and I know the weight of fertilizer that's being applied, I can figure out how many seeds per acre I'm applying based on the weight of seed that I'm applying, right? And so as soon as I do that calculation, that's fine. But if I start out my mix and if I got my wheat seed blended, really there needs to be some room on the drill in order for me to adjust that seeding rate. Let's say if we get into a delayed planting situation. So this happens every year. So I mix my seed up, and with me anyway on the farm, I mix my seed up, fertilizer up, and I have basically one uniform blend. And if I want to increase my seeding rate, for one thing, there needs to be capacity on my drill to increase my seeding rate, for one thing. But yet, when I increase my seeding rate, I also increase the rate on fertilizer as well, which is not a bad thing because we also see higher fertilizer responses with later seeding rates as well. So it's not a bad thing for both of them to increase at the same time, but it does make the calibration trickier when you mix the two at once.
Well,
So
thank you,
answers your
Dave.
question.
Certainly been a pleasure to see you virtually. It was too bad it wasn't in person, but again, it was a good pleasure to hear what's happening in Ontario, and we've got some good ideas from you. So, all right, a big thank you for Dave.